I want to speak tonight about the way in which beauty presses us to a greater concern for justice. Both beauty and justice have in English a shared synonym, the word fairness. We speak of fair faces and fair skies and fair vistas, but in the realm of justice, we also speak of fair playing fields and fair arrangements. It may be surprising to be reminded that the word fair in fair play and fair practice comes etymologically from the aesthetic word fairness, meaning loveliness of countenance or perfection of fit. Both beauty and justice have injury as their opposite. In the case of justice, this is literally the case. The second syllable of the word injury is the same root as in justice, and injury is, I believe, the most accurate opposite to beauty. When we speak about beauty, whether a poem by John Keats, a novel by Emily Bronte, a painting by Matisse, a lover's face, a mathematical proof, or the structure of the atom, we are usually speaking about three different sites, and at each of them, the connection between beauty and justice can be glimpsed. Often when we speak about beauty, we're speaking about the beautiful thing itself, the face of Dante's Beatrice, or a Greek vase, or the view of the Charles River at dawn. And we account for the beauty of such a thing by formal features, such as symmetry, or clarity, or color, or vivacity, or unity. In the second side of beauty, we're speaking not about the object, but about the perceptual event that happens when one of us comes into the presence of the object. And a very famous account of this is the moment when Socrates sees the face of a beautiful young boy, and his knees begin to buckle, and he breaks into a fever, and he begins to sprout wings out of his shoulder blades. The third side of beauty again involves the perceiver, but this time it is not what happens to the perceiver in the first split second of coming upon beauty, but in the minutes and hours and even days afterwards. And what happens in that aftermath is an act of creation. So let me back up to each of these three sites and try to make audible the call to justice that is embedded in each. So back to the first site, the beautiful object itself, a vase, a flower, a lover's face, a painting, a poem. Formal attributes such as symmetry or vivacity anticipate parallel but much, much more difficult to attain attributes in the realm of justice. The symmetry of a beautiful face or a beautiful equation, for example, anticipates John Rawls' definition of justice as fairness, in which fairness requires a symmetry of all our relations to one another. Today, Rawls's theory of justice is one of the most widely known accounts of justice, but it's actually difficult to find any account of justice that does not stress symmetry, whether one is thinking of Plato's emphasis on the way that punishments ought to be symmetrical to crimes, or the way David Hume talked about the way in which expectations and fulfillments ought to be symmetrical to one another, or the way today we speak about the way work and the compensation for that work ought to be symmetrical. Now let me go to the second side of beauty, where it's not the object itself, but the cognitive event that happens when one suddenly comes into the presence of the object. Of the hundreds of accounts we have of this moment over many centuries, two of the most striking are given by two mid-20th century women philosophers, Iris Murdoch and Simone Weil, who speak of the unselfing or radical decentering that comes about in the presence of beauty. Iris Murdoch gives the example of being in a state of self-preoccupation, worrying about her work or worrying that her status has not been fully enough appreciated, and then suddenly seeing a bird lift off in flight. At that moment, she says, all one's self-absorption falls away and one suddenly undergoes an unselfing. The French philosopher and mystic Simone Weil referred to this same phenomenon as a radical decentering because we're suddenly swept to the sidelines. I refer to this state as a state of opiated adjacency, and here's why I like this somewhat awkward term. There are many things in life that put us in a state of acute pleasure, a state of being opiated. And there are many things in life that make us feel marginal or lateral or on the sidelines. But what is deeply and abidingly extraordinary about beautiful things is that they do those two things at once. They put us in a state of bliss at the very moment that they make us feel marginal or secondary, happy to be in a supporting rather than a central character. None of us is the center of the world, but each of us can get into the mistake of believing that we are the center of our own world. Beauty relieves us of this. It not only puts us on the sidelines, but makes us acutely happy to be there on the sidelines. Becoming capable of experiencing bliss in one's own lateralness may not be itself a state of justice, but it certainly prepares us for doing such work in the world. Murdoch arrives at her account of beauty by asking, what is it that helps to make us become good people? Not what lets us talk about being good, but what actually makes us good. And she concludes that of all the causes, the leading one is beauty. Now I turn to the third side of beauty, where one is again speaking of the perceiver, but this time the perceiver in the enduring moment after coming into the presence of what is beautiful. Accounts given over many centuries report the link between the exposure to the beautiful and the desire to create. Diotima, you'll probably remember, told Socrates, who told Plato, who tells us, that the beauty of the face of the person you love gives rise to the desire to bring children into the world. But Diotima says that beautiful persons and things not only prompt the creation of children, but the creation of poems, plays, legal treatises, and works of philosophy. 20th century philosophers agree with Diotima and Socrates and Plato. What is it, Wittgenstein asks, that happens to us when we stand in the presence of a beautiful cathedral, or a beautiful boy, or a beautiful flower? He answers, when the eye sees something beautiful, the hand wants to draw it. Instead of the word creation, it is, in my judgment, useful to sometimes use the prosaic word replication, because that second word reminds us how very widespread this impulse is. There may be very great outcomes, a new child, a new piece of architecture, a breakthrough in mathematical thinking, something we would all recognize as great acts of creation. But the same impulse is evident if one sees something beautiful and wants to take a photograph of it, or tell a friend about it, or simply stand and perpetuate the moment of seeing for 20 seconds more by keeping it within your perceptual horizon. These everyday outcomes are also acts of creation. They are counterfactual. They bring into being something that was not the case before. How is this incitement to creation yoked to justice? It is in two ways. First, while beauty may be either natural or artifactual, that is, beauty may exist in a field of wildflowers, but it may also exist in an act of artistry, as when Monet paints that field of flowers. But justice, in contrast, is always artifactual, always artificial. It always requires acts of human intervention and creation. Anything, therefore, which puts us in touch with our own powers of creation is itself a contribution to the ongoing aspiration for justice. The philosopher David Hume is among those who have emphasized this point. He said that natural virtues need to have some benign outcome in order to be good, whereas the artificial virtues need have no immediately visible outcome, since the mere exercise of our capacity for the artifactual is itself a good outcome. The second way in which beauty, by at once awakening us to our capacity for the artifactual, contributes to justice is simply that it is tied to the desire to bring more and more into the world so that there is eventually enough. That impulse towards plenitude has many names. It may be understood as it was in earlier centuries in terms of infinity or caritas, or as it is today in the language of distribution. So this third side is important both because it incites us to the exercise of the artifactual needed in the realm of justice, and second because it is bound up with a pressure towards distribution, the making of more and more so there will eventually be enough. I have no objection to the fact that advertisers use beautiful persons and scenes to sell things, but it leads to a deeply mistaken idea. It seems to say, when you see something beautiful, buy it. But centuries of philosophers and poets and mathematicians and scientists tell us something very different. When you see something beautiful, begin to repair the injuries of the world. The beautiful things we encounter in the classroom every day call upon us to act on behalf of justice. Thank you.